1864. The Civil War enters its fourth year. Although Union armies have made significant inroads in Tennessee and the Mississippi Valley, battle lines remain relatively unchanged in Virginia. At last, Lincoln finds a general who will fight. Ulysses S. Grant is appointed commander of all Union armies. He determines upon a simple but novel strategy. Advance simultaneously with all his forces on key enemy centers. Grant makes his headquarters with his largest force, the Army of the Potomac, a well-fed, well-supplied, and well-rested army that was ready for the coming ordeal. Confederate General Robert E. Lee understood the realities. His army of Northern Virginia is outnumbered nearly 2-to-1. Supplies are scarce. Obliged to conserve resources, he must fight a defensive war. With luck, his undaunted army will hold back Yankee invaders until fall presidential elections can potentially change the political landscape. The Union Army breaks camp on the evening of May 3rd. The men on both sides have little concept of the horror that lies ahead. The fighting in the coming weeks will kill and wound more of them than at any other time in American history. Grant will operate against Lee's right flank, using coastal waterways to establish and supply his army as it moves. But to carry out this plan, Grant has to advance into the fabled wilderness, a 70-square-mile tract of dense woods and thickets, poorly mapped, with few roads. Its thickets will neutralize Union superiority in numbers and artillery. Grant hopes he can get through it before Lee reacts. Lee does not allow this to happen. He sees that Grant's right is vulnerable and moves with Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps on Orange Turnpike and A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps on the Plank Road. James Longstreet's corps, recently arrived from East Tennessee, has greater distance to cover. Morning, May 5th. Armies collide on both thoroughfares as the struggle develops into two distinct battles, separated by trackless wilderness. Governor Warren's 5th and John Sedgwick's 6th Corps go into position on the right, centered about a clearing called Saunders Field, while Hancock's 2nd Corps occupies the strategic Brock Road intersection. Bitter but inconclusive fighting rages until dark. Grant prepares to deliver a decisive blow come morning. Meanwhile, the Confederates, exhausted and disorganized, anxiously await Longstreet's arrival. The Union attack begins at 5 a.m. Warren and Sedgwick are quickly contained on the turnpike. Hancock crushes a ragged Confederate line on Plank Road, and the day appears lost for Lee. Longstreet's arrival turns the tide as his brigades press Hancock back, but Longstreet is badly wounded at a critical moment. His attack loses momentum. Lee pauses and strikes again on the Brock Road. The fighting rages, but determined Union counterattacks drive the rebels back. Later that afternoon, Georgian John B. Gordon launches a vigorous attack on Sedgwick's exposed right flank, capturing many prisoners. But darkness ends the affair before further damage can be done. The fighting causes the dry woods to catch fire. Many wounded men perish in the flames. Both sides fortify their positions. Earthworks and trenches scar the landscape for miles. Stalemate ensues. Soldiers are exhausted. Nearly 30,000 have been killed, wounded, or captured. This 3-day fight in the wilderness is the 4th bloodiest battle of the war up to that time. Both commanders have learned something about each other. Grant discovers Lee's army is more formidable than any opponent he has faced. Open flanks led to embarrassing reversals. Grant will ensure that this does not happen again during this campaign. Lee realizes his opponent is a man of different character. Grant is not retreating as his predecessors had. Instead, Grant pushes southward toward the crucial crossroads at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Union morale skyrockets. Grant is continuing the advance on Richmond. Warren's 5th Corps is leading the advance, slowed by Confederate cavalry. Warren reaches a clearing near Spotsylvania called Laurel Hill, but Lee has won the race to the crossroads. The path ahead is blocked by Joseph B. Kershaw's veteran division. Confederate forces quickly dig in, creating a formidable defensive position. George Meade, Army of the Potomac commander, orders Sedgwick's 6th Corps to support Warren in the attack on the Confederate position at Laurel Hill. It does not go well. Delays and ultimately concentrated rebel fire halts the attack. As the balance of the armies come up, the battle lines extend for miles. Both sides dig in and prepare for the upcoming ordeal. Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan cuts loose on a raid towards Richmond. Grant hopes this move will force Confederate cavalry hero Jeb Stuart into a showdown battle with Sheridan, the competent Yankee newcomer. 3 days later at Yellow Tavern, Sheridan found his path blocked by Stuart. A sharp skirmish ensues. Jeb Stuart is mortally wounded and dies the next day. Heavy skirmishing continues throughout May 9th as Union soldiers probe the surrounding wilderness, trying to determine the position of Lee's army. Union General Sedgwick, beloved commander of the 6th Corps, is killed, the victim of a sharpshooter's bullet. Grant has received reinforcements in the form of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. He orders Burnside to advance on Spotsylvania along the Fredericksburg Road. This forces Lee to bend back his right flank, creating a vulnerable bulge in his lines, dubbed the Mule Shoe. Meanwhile, Lee entrenches his line and continues to improve it. Confederate artillery is positioned to pour crossfire upon any attacking column. After Sedgwick's death, Horatio Wright assumes command over the 6th Corps. He spies a weak point in the Confederate line and orders Colonel Emory Upton to exploit it. With 12 hand-picked regiments, the carefully planned attack advances in lines 4 regiments deep. It's an innovative idea. Upton's men burst out of trees a mere 200 yards from the rebel works and pour through the lines of the shocked Confederates. In desperate fighting, nearly 1,000 rebels are captured, but the Yankees get no support. Confederate reinforcements force Upton's attackers to retreat, abandoning their dead and wounded. Although a failure, this sort of attack was revolutionary in concept and execution. It will be used again. Heavy skirmishing continues along the line on May 11th, as both Grant and Lee plan their next moves. As his target, Grant selects the Mule Shoe. The attack is scheduled for early the next morning, May 12th. Throughout the day and well into the evening, Union troops move into position. Meanwhile, Lee uncharacteristically misinterprets Grant's intentions. He thinks Grant is about to retreat and removes key artillery pieces from the mule shoe. Modeled upon Upton's charge, a massive Union attack, spearheaded by Winfield Scott Hancock's veteran Second Corps, roll over the Confederate line. 5,000 rebels are captured, including 2 generals and numerous cannons. In desperate straits, Lee coordinates a series of counterattacks that drive Union forces back. The entire line was recaptured, except at the angle of the bulge, or mule shoe itself, ever after christened the Bloody Angle. Here, a bitter struggle ensues as Union forces desperately cling to their limited gains against repeated Confederate counterattacks. The soldiers fight at point-blank range, with only a few feet between them. The battle rages along a narrow front. After 18 hours of constant combat, the Confederates withdraw to a hastily constructed reserve line. The 2 armies are exhausted after 7 days of intense fighting. Stymied, Grant proposes to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Over the next week, the battle lines pivot southward, but Grant resolves to break off the action at this point. Spotsylvania would emerge as the 3rd bloodiest battle of the Civil War. In a bold move, Grant quits the field, hoping to turn Lee's right flank again and make for Richmond. Lee, however, knows his intentions and races for the North Anna River, 20 miles to the south. Arriving on May 22nd, Lee establishes a strong blocking position on a series of commanding bluffs south of the river. Grant reaches the North Anna on May 23rd and begins crossing that very day, testing the rebel lines. Several days of indecisive fighting follow as Grant realizes the formidable nature of Lee's position. It's a trap designed to force Grant to split his army into pieces where it can be defeated in detail. Grant withdraws across the river and once again advances around the Confederate right flank in search of an opportunity to catch Lee's veterans in the open, away from field fortifications. On the North Anna line, Lee has missed his best opportunity of striking a decisive blow. Lee knows that he must stop Grant before he reaches the Richmond area. If not, Grant will besiege the Confederate capital, and the city's demise would be a mere question of time. Grant cuts loose from the line at North Anna and sweeps southeast, closer to Richmond. The armies are back on familiar turf, ground of McClellan's campaign 2 years previous. The opposing forces clash on a front that stretches several miles along Totopotomoy Creek. By the 1st of June, Grant has pivoted around Richmond, and his soldiers seize the strategic crossroads at Old Cold Harbor. Fighting erupts near sundown, but the results are inconclusive. Grant, sensing an opportunity to crush Lee, orders the attack renewed at dawn. He awaits the arrival of significant reinforcements, William F. Smith's 18th Corps from Butler's Army of the James, operating south of Richmond. But reinforcements require additional time. The attack is postponed 24 hours until June 3rd. It is a fatal delay. Confederates use the time to consolidate and fortify their positions. Now, masters of the art, Lee's veterans erect elaborate earthworks with well-sighted artillery positions, creating deadly crossfires. Dawn, June 3rd. The 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps assault the Confederate lines on a broad front. and are repulsed with staggering losses. Confederate General Evander Law said, "It wasn't war, it was murder." For Grant's part, he wrote, "I always regretted the second attack at Cold Harbor." Once more, the two armies are in stalemate. Grant is unwilling to admit defeat and plans future operations. Meanwhile, conditions on the field are unbearably inhumane. No truce is declared to bury dead or recover wounded lying between opposing forces. Cutting railroads would isolate Richmond from the Deep South. Grant decides to take the war across the James River and strike Richmond from the south via the railroad center at Petersburg. Fooled, Lee fails to see his enemy's intentions, and Grant withdraws from the Cold Harbor line unmolested by Confederates. Union forces are reinvigorated by the mere sight of the James River. The horrors of the wilderness lay far behind. Most cross the wide river on lengthy pontoon bridges, an engineering feat thought to be impossible by many. The Overland Campaign is over. There had never been such a bloodletting upon this continent. From the Rapidan to the James River, the butcher's bill was more than 80,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. All in less than 6 weeks. Contrary to popular opinion, both commanding generals displayed both brilliance and poor judgment. Grant fights his way to the gates of Richmond. Lee becomes pinned in the Richmond and Petersburg defenses. The Army of Northern Virginia has been staggered, but not destroyed. Lee, however, is unable to replace those lost, and his army will not recover from the recent ordeals. But his soldiers, man for man, have proven more than a match for Grant. The war enters a new phase in the more open country south of the James River. The fortified lines and breastworks extend for miles around Richmond and Petersburg. Lee's prophecy comes true. Grant crosses the James, besieges Richmond, and 10 months later, forces the demise of the Confederate capital, the Army of Northern Virginia, and ultimately, the Confederacy itself.
By the end of the Civil War's second year, Union forces in the West controlled much of the Mississippi River, except for one vital stretch. Few Northern boats tested the strong Confederate river batteries at Port Hudson or at Vicksburg, known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. President Abraham Lincoln claimed Vicksburg the key to winning the Civil War. But by late 1862, Union naval efforts there had failed. That key remained firmly in Southern hands. Using the Mississippi River and its major tributaries to move men and munitions, the Union Army had won a series of victories in the West, and they hadn't done it alone. In late 1861, the U.S. War Department had rapidly built a fleet of ironclad riverboats never before seen in warfare. By late 1862, this brown water navy and Major General Ulysses S. Grant's army set their sights on the city that, Confederate President Jefferson Davis claimed was the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. With most of the South's ports blockaded by Union ships, Vicksburg's connection to the Trans-Mississippi region made it critical to the Confederacy's very survival. Texas beef and Louisiana sugar, salt, and molasses fed the Southern armies. Lead from Missouri filled Southern rifles, and it all funneled through Vicksburg's rail lines. The defense of Vicksburg and Port Hudson fell to Lieutenant General John Pemberton, who was a Pennsylvanian by birth, but sided with the South at the urging of his wife, a Virginian. With little combat experience, his orders are to hold Vicksburg at all costs. In late 1862, Grant began his campaign for Vicksburg with a two-pronged strike, intending to lure Confederate forces from Vicksburg with the first prong, while the second, commanded by Major General William Sherman, struck at the city's lightly held defenses. But Confederate cavalry hit first, cutting Grant's long supply line, forcing him to fall back and allowing Confederates to shift men by rail to defeat Sherman's attacks at Chickasaw Bayou in late December. Grant spends the winter and early spring of 1863 trying a variety of routes to Vicksburg, each ending in failure. Yet amidst growing public cries to replace him, and against the advice of his closest advisors, Grant grew bolder, embarking upon the largest amphibious campaign in American history up to that time. In late March, Grant orders Major General John McClernand's 13th Corps to improve the route across Louisiana's swampy river bottoms. Out of the reach of Vicksburg's big guns, the Union force would then be ferried across the mighty river and onto Mississippi soil. Grant's plan is intricate, risky. Success hinges on Admiral David Porter's fleet of gunboats and troop transports, which on the night of April 16th make a daring race past the Vicksburg batteries, hugging the riverbank below to withstand their fire. Even with Porter's fleet south of Vicksburg, Grant continues to keep Pemberton guessing as to where he'll attack. On April 17th, the day after Porter's daring run, Grant launches a Federal cavalry raid into the heart of Mississippi. On April 29th, Sherman feints an attack north of Vicksburg, while Union gunboats shell Grand Gulf, where Grant actually plans to ferry his army across the Great River. The cavalry raid ties up Pemberton's cavalry, leaving river crossings unguarded. Sherman's feint draws Confederate attention north of the city. Both keep Pemberton distracted from the true threat at Grand Gulf. The batteries there were too strong for Union gunboats, so Grant adapts and crosses instead at Bruinsburg. By April 30th, Grant realizes a goal he had toiled 6 months to achieve. The lead element of his army is on the Confederate side of the river. For the next 17 days, his army would march more than 200 miles and fight 5 battles in a campaign never before witnessed on American soil. Moving inland, up steep bluffs, marched the soldiers of McClernand's Corps. In the early morning hours of May 1st, they hit a Confederate brigade. For the next 17 hours, up to 8,000 Confederates put up a noble defense in the rugged terrain surrounding Fort Gibson, holding back 20,000 Federals. By late afternoon, outflanked and low on ammunition, the Confederates fall back. The loss here causes the Confederate evacuation of Grand Gulf on May 2nd. With his beachhead secure, Grant's plan truly unfolds. Now, aware of Grant's true intentions, Pemberton assumes he will march north for Vicksburg. But Grant has already rejected that approach as too restrictive. Instead, using the Big Black River as a shield, he plans to cut the rail line which feeds Vicksburg with supplies and reinforcements. Then he will turn and trap Pemberton at Vicksburg. It was this type of bold, indirect strategy that would become the hallmark of Grant's military career. By May 12th, joined by Sherman's Corps, Grant marches along a 10-mile front aiming to attack the Southern Railroad the next morning. Pemberton shifts his army and rushes a Confederate brigade by rail to Jackson with orders to strike Grant's right flank. These 3,000 Confederates slam into Major General James McPherson's 10,000 men along the banks of 14 Mile Creek, just southwest of Raymond. Unaware that they are outnumbered 3-1, Confederates launch a fierce attack. After almost 6 hours, McPherson's artillery and numeric advantage has the rebels retreating to Jackson. Realizing he can't safely march on Vicksburg with a large body of Confederates now at his rear, Grant wields 2/3 of his army toward the state capital. He cuts rail and telegraph lines along the way and hinders communication between Pemberton and the one man sent to assist him. On the night of May 13th, General Joe Johnston, the hero of 1st Manassas, arrives at Jackson to take charge of the grim Confederate predicament in Mississippi. Within hours, even as his reinforcements near Jackson, Johnston wires the authorities in Richmond that he is too late and orders the city evacuated. The next morning, Sherman and McPherson's divisions push back Confederate artillery and roadblocks from a handful of Confederate regiments. By late afternoon on May 14th, the United States flag flies once again over the state capitol. Grant spares none of his men to occupy Jackson and put its military supplies and rail lines to the torch. Then he turns his army toward Vicksburg. As Jackson burned, Pemberton had moved with 20,000 men to attack Grant's supply line. Without a working telegraph, Confederate communications unraveled. As Johnston gathers reinforcements to the northeast, Pemberton moves southeast. On May 16th, Pemberton receives a 2-day-old message from Johnston, ordering him to Clinton. As Pemberton reverses his column, Grant closes in. Pemberton hastily deploys his divisions along a 3-mile front to face 2 advancing Federal columns, but he is unaware of a third moving toward his exposed left flank. Brigadier General Stephen Lee of Stevenson's division shifts his brigade to a hill owned by Sid Champion. Brigadier General Alfred Cummings' Georgians moved to fill a gap and block the Union division's closing on the Middle Road. And at 10:30 that morning at Champion Hill, Grant starts the battle, destined to seal Vicksburg's eventual fate. If Pemberton's thin left flank crumbles, Grant will control the Baker's Creek Bridge and Pemberton's escape route to Vicksburg. Seth Barton's Georgia Brigade hustles to stop the Union onslaught. By 11:30 a.m., the fighting on Champion Hill turns viciously hand-to-hand, with Stevenson's division eventually thrown back to the Jackson Road. Major General John Bowen's division savagely drives the Federals back to the Champion House. But a second Federal assault overwhelms them. Reinforcements led by Major General William Loring arrive too late, and Bowen's men fall back. Their retreat turns to panic as Grant's divisions converge. Their main escape route now cut off. Pemberton's men had managed to construct a second bridge, which they used to retreat to Edwards, though not before Grant's army is able to strand Loring on the east side of Baker's Creek. Out of communication with Pemberton, and believing Grant has already taken Edwards, Loring orders his vital 8,000-man division to Jackson and away from the defenses at Vicksburg. Unaware of Loring's decision, Pemberton waits for him that night in the fortification at the Big Black River Bridge. Instead, he is met the next morning by McClernand's corps, which immediately attack and send the rebels running to the safety of Vicksburg. The battles at Champion Hill and Big Black River cost Pemberton dearly: 25% of his army, 45 cannon, and the faith of his men. 30 years ago to the day, Pemberton had accepted a cadetship to West Point. As he rode back to Vicksburg, he notes, "And today, that career is ended in disaster and disgrace. Grant's trap is now set." On May 17th, Pemberton's demoralized soldiers, reeling from the loss at Big Black River, began streaming into the city. They worked through the night to shore up their fortifications. Vicksburg's land defenses stretched more than 8 miles, with 9 major forts connected by rifle pits, artillery embrasures, and parapets of earthen logs. One such stockade redan guarded the graveyard road leading into Vicksburg. Wanting to avoid a lengthy siege, Grant attacks here on May 19th. After a 5-hour artillery barrage, Sherman goes in, but piles of brush and sharpened tree limbs unravel formations as Confederate crossfire cuts men down in scores. Pinned down, Confederates lob hand grenades into their midst. The Federals use the cover of darkness to fall back to their lines. Almost 1,000 of Grant's men are killed, wounded, or missing. Behind his stout defenses, Pemberton loses only 70. On May 22nd, Grant tries again on a much wider 3-mile front. Only McClernand's corps gains a foothold. He sends Grant a message to keep up the pressure. But they are beaten back and lose another 3,000 men. Grant realizes he has no other choice but to lay siege, ordering his commanders to dig their lines closer to the Confederate trenches. By mid-June, they began mining beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and on June 25th, the Federals explode 2,200 pounds of black powder. Soldiers from both sides pour into the crater, fighting for more than 20 hours before Grant calls off the attacks. By July 6th, the Federals will be prepared to detonate 13 more mines, but it will not be necessary. For 47 days, soldiers and Vicksburg citizens endure a constant nightmare. Day and night, up to 220 cannon blast the southern defenses from the land as Porter's gunboats shelled Vicksburg's batteries from the river. Citizens took to living in hillside caves for shelter. Food and water grow scarce. As disease flourishes, medical supplies dwindle. Every public building and many homes are now hospitals. Wagons make daily rounds to pick up the dead. Rebel soldiers' rations are by now a handful of peas and rice and a single cup of water per day. Sickness and desertion leave fewer men on the front lines. One day in late June, a notice slid under the door of Pemberton's headquarters. It reads, "If you can't feed us, surrender us." Signed, many soldiers. following a dire report from his subordinates that his army lacks the strength to make a breakout attack. On July 2nd, Pemberton realizes he has no choice. He must surrender. On July 3rd, 1863, there came a sound, ominous for some, for weeks unheard by all. Silence. That day, Grant and Pemberton meet to discuss terms of surrender. With the anniversary of American independence only a day away, Pemberton hopes Grant will be in a generous mood. Instead, Grant demands unconditional surrender. Pemberton refuses. Later that evening, Grant offers terms. Instead of taking Pemberton's army prisoner, he will parole them. Many will go home at once. Pemberton accepts, and on the 4th of July, the Confederates stack arms, handing over the city of Vicksburg to the Union forces. The South's Gibraltar had fallen. With the capture of Port Hudson, 5 days later, the Mississippi River is entirely in Union hands. Grant loses 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing, and inflicts nearly as many losses on the Confederates. But aided by Porter's fleet, he disperses an entire rebel army and cuts the South's supply line. Soon, even the most basic goods like salt to preserve meat would grow increasingly scarce. Yet the Vicksburg Campaign is overshadowed in the press by the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg the day before. And only in the coming decades would Grant's accomplishment be recognized. Late into the 20th century, coalition forces in the First Gulf War were still using tactics inspired by Grant's Vicksburg Campaign. And it was at Vicksburg that the blue and the gray found unity in the cause of preservation. Their efforts resulted in the establishment of the Vicksburg National Military Park in 1899. Today, that preservation effort continues, so that the sacrifices made there by both sides will not be forgotten.